Thanks for joining us. Julie Farrell with Director's Mortgage, and I've got Noah Blanton here once again. Thank you for
Hello.
joining me. Noah is president of WFG Oregon. He has over 20 years experience, not 6 months. And we're very fortunate to have him here and sharing his expert opinions on just a few topics that I think are current, relevant, and I'm getting a ton of questions on. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing your expertise. We always appreciate that.
Thank you for having me back.
Yeah. So I know last time we started with the question that was on the tip of everyone's tongues. Are we on the precipice of a bubble, a housing bubble? And I'd like to start there because the dynamics of our industry have changed. Interest rates have gone up. We're at the end of all of the moratoriums on forbearance and rental eviction moratoriums. Yeah. And so I think that there's this sense that something big is about to happen. And I'm curious what you're sharing with experts and partners as far as what you think is going to transpire in regards to a housing bubble.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is no. I don't think we're on the precipice of some large housing bubble. I know there's probably some concern about a 10 to 20% devaluation like we experienced in 2008. But no, the short answer is no. Fundamentally, I think things are just so much different than they were at that point in time. And it's not just one thing. There's a lot of things that are different that would tell us that we're not, in a bubble. And one would be the quality of loans, as you well know. I mean, we don't.
Thank you.
We don't have this massive, the bubble that really popped. But the bubble that popped really wasn't in valuation. I think that's important. The bubble that popped really was in the sort of time bomb that went off inside of these loan portfolios, where you had all of these really toxic loans that began to reset, and not to get too far into the weeds with that, but when you're talking about fundamentals, and then so you have all of these sort of assets go bad that if we had really looked, we probably would have known they were going to go bad, and then you have normal buyers and sellers in the market, but on top of that you flood inventory with a bunch of these foreclosed properties. We don't have anything like that. So we would have to turn our attention more towards really fundamental supply and demand type of things that we would look at, and there's nothing that would indicate that we're going to have a devaluation of the value of real estate.
Right. I'm seeing those same forecasts. And I think it's interesting, too. You guys have a foreclosure division at WFG. Is that correct?
Yeah, we do.
And
a
default division. And so I've heard some of the forecasting for what you're expecting in the months and year to come as far as foreclosures go. And it's minuscule compared to the wave that we saw during the Great Recession.
I think that's a really important point, is even if we were going to have foreclosures, which sort of are what people expect is, precedes a bubble because you get a bunch more inventory, so it depresses the price. Even if we were going to have that, and to your point, I don't think we are, we would see it coming. There are timelines where we would see this. We would see 30 to 89 day lates, and then we would see 90 day plus lates, and then we would see notice of defaults filed, and then we would see notice of foreclosures filed. And every state has this different timeline to get to where a property actually becomes a foreclosed REO property. Let's say it was starting today, as a for instance. We would see it coming, then we would be able to sort of quantify what the total amount was, and we're at least 12 to 18 months out from any of that inventory hitting the market. And we're also not starting from a place of 2 to 3 or 4 months worth of inventory. We're starting from a place of zero inventory. I mean, effectively, we have no inventory. 0.6 months of inventory is not inventory.
No.
And so you start to line all of these things up, and I think the great concern is, of course, as a buyer, I've seen prices increase rapidly. Should I expect some sort of counter to that, like I would have seen in 2008? And it's just the fundamentals just aren't there. We don't have the toxic loans. We don't have inventory to start with, and most people are better positioned to stay in their home regardless of what happens in the economy. So it would be a really hard case to make today that there's some great devaluation coming. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain places in the country. We talked about this last time. I mean, yes, there are some places in the country where there are higher default rates, and there should be concern about that. But there are also places in the country generally that aren't propped up by demand. There's not as much demand there.
Right.
And we don't know what the demand ceiling is in every market, but I certainly say in the Oregon market specifically, we're not close to a demand ceiling.
Right. And despite interest rates rising, which they have been, it's expected they're going to continue to rise this year, we're not seeing a lack of interest in purchase money lending, in purchase activity. That's not slowing the desire for purchase down. It's changing planning, but it's not slowing down the need for it. And I think that that's an interesting segue into new construction, because that's what is here to help stave off our lack of housing. We need new houses. But unfortunately, we've been behind on building new construction for
a long time.
A
decade.
decade.
It's been a decade of underbuilding.
Absolutely. And so the solution of new homes and existing homes, I mean, there's a lack, and there's no real end in sight to that demand being met, which is another factor I think that plays into the overall scope of whether or not we're in a space where a bubble will occur. It's a supply and demand situation.
And I think, new construction is a big piece of that, and we touched on that a little bit before, but unless we expect the inputs to new construction to decrease, it's a much easier thing to sort of quantify or qualify it and say, do we expect the inputs, the raw inputs, to decrease? Do we expect land to get less expensive? Do we expect skilled labor to get less expensive in the trades? Do we expect the cost of the regulatory costs? Do we expect the raw materials cost? I don't know what lumber futures are today, but they were $1,500 or $1,600 a few days ago, up from $400 to $600 18 to 20 months ago. So unless we were to look out and say we expect all of the inputs to new construction to devalue, we wouldn't expect, first off, that product to be less expensive. So that might stitch into a larger conversation about whether we expect housing to become less expensive altogether. But then we just simply don't have enough new construction either. And we've put roughly the same amount of housing into, let's talk about the Portland metro market specifically, which would include Southwest Washington. We put roughly 122 to 123,000 new housing units, single family and multifamily, in the 2 previous decades. So it would be 250,000 units total over the last 20 years. But the type of product we put into the market in the last 10 years is completely different than what we put in before, and we've grown our population. So we really can't build our way out of the problem at this point, because we're 10 years behind.
Too far behind.
Yeah, it'll take us some time to catch up. And building fundamentally changed in the recession as well. Builders still remain more cautious today, and I think the financial backers and lenders around builders remain more cautious today. No builder wants to get stuck with a vast amount of spec inventory, especially, and there's some struggle inside of that as well. How do you pre-sell if you don't know what your costs are in between the 6 or 9 months that you're going to complete a product? And so we're behind the ball on new construction, and I wouldn't expect that we can sort of build our way out of the inventory problem just from the place we're starting from. That I don't think is going to happen.
So still an inventory shortage. So we expect values to stay where they're at, preventing, once again, furthermore, the opportunity for a housing bubble to hit or pop. Well, that's great information, but that also means that values are going to continue to gain. The demand is still there. The shortage isn't going away. So I know that we didn't talk about this, but what advice can you give to home buyers in this marketplace? Any sort of thoughts or tidbits that you think are important for them to consider?
Well, I have two things I always say, and the first is the best time to plant a tree was always three years ago. So I mean, the best time to buy a house was always 3 years ago, right? It's like everybody's, oh, should I buy today? It was maybe it was better 3 years ago, or whatever. As you sort of move along the timeline. But I look at single family residential real estate pretty simply, and if you need a place to live, you should buy a home. And unless you don't plan on spending any money on housing, you should buy. And most people have to have some spend on housing. And the better way always to meet that need in the long run is to own real estate. So I think you should buy when you need it. You should buy what you can afford. It has utility to you. You get to live in it. It has other benefits. There are some tax benefits depending on what your situation is. But delaying that purchase, I don't see a lot of upside to delaying the purchase unless you believe that there's going to be a significant devaluing or a significant diminishing of demand. And then you might try to time that and say, I'm going to buy at this specific time. But historically, if you look back, it's very difficult to pick that timeline, that month on a time, on this time continuum. So I think if you need real estate, you should buy it, and it'll serve you well while you have it, and then you move on and sell it. If you need to sell next year, probably not. Don't buy real estate. But if the hold time is that 3 to 7 years that generally people tend to hold real estate, I think you should buy when you need it, and buy what you can afford.
That's a very good message. Yes. Very good message. I like that one, Noah.
You're going to get stuck otherwise because your alternative is renting, and there is not a disconnect between the cost of renting and the cost of single family. There isn't. Those two things are playing against each other. And actually, I think your cost to rent may rise faster than your cost to own in this market for a variety of different reasons. But renting is not going to be cheaper for you. It's just not. And that's not to say I don't understand housing is expensive and has been getting more expensive. I get that. But if your alternative is I'm going to go into this cheap rental, you may be surprised.
Couldn't agree with you more. And to case in point, I mean, two $17 an hour buyers, right? They're worried about how they're going to come up with down payment, not just the 17-hour worker, but just anyone that is renting. I think that the number one fear that they have is down payment. I don't have enough, I haven't saved up, or student loan debt. Those are the two factors that I hear as far as objections go. Student loan debt, there's lots of different ways that gets calculated. We don't look at the balance, we look at minimum monthly payments due, and Fannie and Freddie both have alternating nuances on how they calculate that. But as far as down payment goes, you don't have to have a down payment to get into housing. I'm not suggesting that this is the best strategy. However, when you're looking at increasing gains in equity, when you're looking at increasing interest rates and an opportunity to get in at a cost of housing expense that's pretty similar to what you're paying in rent.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, people think it's far-fetched that they can't afford this, that they can't make this happen. And I did the math. It's a lower purchase price at $440, but two $17 an hour workers with a modest debt load. I've still factored in a car payment, a credit card, or something along those lines. They can purchase a $440,000 home without any money out of pocket and keep that housing expense probably pretty similar to a 3-bedroom, 2-bath rental home.
Yeah. And in a state that has rent control, you should never expect your rent to be less, ever. Mm-hmm. So we've sort of set a floor on how low the rent can go, and the expectation is it will rise at whatever the level is that the state will allow it to rise every year. And so you're almost sort of baking in the fact that you are going to have increases in your rent every year, where when you buy, you fix that cost. And so I think it also provides some stability in what your housing cost is going to be. So, there's a lot of dynamic around that. But if we're looking at the primary alternative to buying for those folks that you laid out that scenario to, the odds are good that you can expect your cost to go up every year if you're renting.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy, you've locked that cost in, you fixed it, you kind of know what it is. So,
and you get the benefit of appreciation if that's happening. You
Yep.
get the tax deductibility potentially.
Yep.
Check with a tax preparer.
Yep.
But there are tremendous
Yep.
advantages for homeownership.
Yeah. So I always think if you need real estate and you can, buy it.
I love it. All right. Well, that's a great way to wrap up. Thanks so much, Noah.
Thank you.
This was fun.